Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Anusha Chitturi. I am with the Inno Center for Transportation. I will be moderating today's webinar on micromobility, taking stock, and planning for the future. Before I start, I just want to mention that I am recovering from a flu. So if I break into a cough at any point, someone from my team will take over and continue the discussion. I apologize if that happens. Um, Today we will be focusing on new modes of micromobility that have popped up in cities more recently. Public bike share systems have sort of existed in cities for quite some time now, but shared electric bikes and scooters are new additions to the micromobility ecosystem. And their growth has, quite frankly, been very rapid and dynamic in cities. Um, and so, like all of the modes, they have also been impacted because of the pandemic. So, our focus really for this discussion is to try and understand and trace some of the recent developments in micromobility, just understanding how ridership has changed through the pandemic, and also trying to understand how these modes are positioned to address some of the long-standing mobility challenges that our cities are seeing, including accessibility, equity, affordability, and sustainability. So we will be getting into some of these questions, and um, we have a very interesting panel of speakers joining us today to talk about this topic, both from the public and private sector. So I'll go ahead and introduce the panel. Josh Johnson is the Senior Policy Manager for Transit Bikes and Scooters at Lyft. Carrie Byrne is the Senior Program Manager at NACTO, where she leads bicycle and shared micromobility programs. Melinda Hansen is the founder of Brightside, where she leads public affairs and applied research to advance sustainable urban mobility. So before we get into the discussion, I will go over some minor housekeeping. So if you run into technical issues at any point during the webinar, you can just try refreshing your browser or quitting the session and rejoining. That usually helps. If you still run into issues, you can click on the help button that you see on the bottom left of your screen. And we will be taking questions through the webinar or towards the end if time permits. So please keep sending us your questions using the question tab that you see on the bottom right corner. So with that, I would like to get started. We just have 45 minutes, so I'll get right into it. So Josh, I would like to start with you first. Given your experience with Lyft, could you talk about some of the recent ridership trends in, particularly for shared electric bikes and electric scooters, and also talk about how the ridership has changed through the pandemic, and how the kinds of trips that these modes tend to serve and types of users that these modes tend to serve. Yeah, over to you.
Thanks. I'll just start with a brief expansion of your introduction. So as a senior policy manager with Lyft, I oversee kind of our Mountain West regions in terms of our micromobility programs. And then I also lead our federal policy portfolio, which includes advocating for the Bicycle Commuter Act and working towards opportunities with electrification and the funding streams that have come out of the IIJA. I've been involved in micromobility since really the rise of dockless, both bikes and scooters in 2017, formerly with Spin before joining Lyft, and then with the city of Minneapolis establishing its programs, like I said, starting in 2017. So it's definitely near and dear to me. We've seen a significant amount of growth through the pandemic. So, there was obviously kind of a flat period where in kind of the initial peak in March or so of 2020, there was a significant amount of depression of use just as people were sheltering in place, and we were kind of working to recover from that. But since then, due to really people coming back to work, transit systems having budgets reduced and service reductions, throughout the US, and just the bike boom kind of building on that, we've seen significant growth. So across our systems, we've achieved over 60 million trips this year, which was the number for the full year 2021 for us. We're on track to hit 70 to 75 million trips this year, which is 25% year over year growth. In 2019, e-bikes were about 10% of our rides or less. Now we're over 40%. And part of that is just growth in our e-bike fleet, but also just general popularity of e-bikes being the top selling electric vehicles in the US. I think, is something that's certainly extended to shared micromobility as well. We've also seen in specific markets, almost every single one we operate saw record ridership in some form or another over the course of this year. So City Bike had its highest ridership month ever in New York City and New Jersey, 3.7 million trips in August. They also broke their all-time daily ridership record 3 times, most recently in September. In Boston, we saw record ridership in August and September on the Blue Bike system. Chicago, July and August. On the Divvy system, were record-breaking months with almost 1 million trips in July in the Divvy system. And DC broke their previous record monthly ridership with almost 500,000 trips in July. So we've really seen, not only kind of the return from pre-pandemic levels, but really ongoing growth in shared micromobility across all of our systems here at Lyft. And I think, beyond that, we've also seen kind of a change in the nature of ridership during that time. We've seen the commute as kind of a use case continue to grow through the pandemic, especially as people are returning to work. It's not necessarily as pronounced as it was, but we're really seeing the kind of commute hour window increase in the number of rides. And we've also seen from our multimodal report in 2021, almost a third of our users consistently use shared bikes and scooters for commuting purposes. We've also found a growth in members. About 10 times, members take about 10 times as many rides as a casual rider. And over the course of this year, we've seen that grow the number of members, the share of members in our system from 62% to 70%. So that's really kind of a sign of a good, healthy system, turning casual, sometimes riders into habitual riders, and really a promising sign for micromobility. And then leisure rides, of course, are something that micromobility is a common use case for. They've brought millions of new riders into our systems to try bikes and scooters. We've seen through the pandemic, of course, kind of the use of parks and green spaces as really a common reason for shared micromobility trips. And as an example, in August, our top 20 stations on City Bike were either along a major park or a major bike path or a park. So, that use case isn't new, isn't surprising, but just something that has continued to grow as people try to get out and experience their cities.
Thank you so much. I think thanks for sharing those statistics and details. I think that sort of sets the context for our discussion. I'd like to go over to Melinda next and ask her to talk about, you've had some private sector experience and you've worked with Bird before. So I think you'll agree with me when I say that most of these micromobility modes, they have their growth has been very dynamic, like I said, and they have entered the market. And there's been a lot of experimentation in the recent past, just in terms of the types of vehicles and the kinds of street infrastructure, whether it's docked or dockless, not just in the US, but globally. So could you talk a little about what's driving some of these changes and the dynamism in the micromobility sector? And do you see this sort of stabilizing in the near future?
Yeah. Just to give a little bit more background, I was the head of sustainability at Bird from 2018 through 2020, and then have since consulted with several shared micromobility companies, in particular in Europe. And I would say that it's been pretty remarkable to see how much the industry has changed and evolved. In the very early days, people didn't think it would last because there were dockless bikes before it. And that was a very quick blip that came and went over the course of about 6 months. And when dockless electric scooters came on the scene, I think there was a lot of assumption that that would be the same kind of pattern. And that's not at all what happened. Electric scooters attracted a whole new group of people who never took bike share before. And what we've seen is that cities have held the systems to very high standards, which makes a lot of sense, I think, because of the way that they came in and kind of took the Uber approach of asking for forgiveness and not for permission, which wasn't a great start to the industry. But since I would say every company that I'm familiar with has gotten much more professional in their operations and in their collaboration with cities. And it's been nice to watch the progression, right, from going from this sort of like do whatever you want, like a bit of a tech bro arrogance, to companies hiring professional folks who really understand policy and understand transport systems and understand how to set up systems that better integrate micromobility with public transit. So that's a really nice trend to see, and I certainly hope that continues in the coming years.
Thanks so much. I would like to go to Carrie next. So given your experience with NACTO and your experience working sort of with cities and on the public sector side, can you tell us a little about how cities are perceiving these rapid changes to urban travel and how that perception has sort of changed over the years?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Carrie. Thanks for having me. So I think of this mode in sort of 3 stages, and we're in like a 3rd stage that's sort of just beginning. The first stage focusing on station-based bike share in the US, starting about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. And that was a really strong partnership, city-led effort where cities were really taking the lead and saying, we want bike share in our cities to support people as a transportation mode. And cities were taking ownership over this option. And that there was a lot of growth during that era too. Sort of 100-fold increase in trips in that first almost 10 years of these systems. Then the second stage in my mind is just a couple years long, and it's this focused time of disruption, and trips immediately or almost immediately doubled nationally on shared micromobility systems. So enormously popular addition, but not regulated in any way at first by cities. And so the goals of these programs were very different, and the trips that people were taking were focused in areas that the companies were providing these devices, and not areas where cities were saying, we want to have these services. In this sort of more now era, there's been a bit of a settling down of the industry, and a lot more partnership has emerged. And I think it's a really exciting time for this mode and this industry to really collaborate on thinking about who do we want to provide these options for, and how do we want to regulate them so that they remain viable, but they can also become equitable programs that cities and operators can both really have a lot of like pride and ownership in them, in what they're doing and who they're serving. And to do this, I think there's sort of a few trends that have emerged in this more recent time. We're still sort of seeing how this change is coming about, but just very broadly, there's a more of a blurry line between station-based and dockless as cities and operators are thinking about how to serve different areas with different densities and different potential demand and different potential profitability. And there's a shift to more of a partnership where cities are selecting operators to really meet the goals that they have for their program, and are trying to set up more collaborative and longer term operating agreements that can be flexible, but also can hold operators to a high standard. With that, cities are continuing to invest in engagement and working with companies to make sure people know about these programs. I think that's a big area of focus in this sort of current stage. And cities are continuing to invest in infrastructure, because without safe places to ride, these programs cannot really function. And so that's like a major component of building a strong shared micromobility system.
Thank you for that, and thank you for covering the whole range of approaches that cities are taking. And partnerships is something that we'll get into towards the end of this discussion. That's a key part of this discussion. So before that, I would like to sort of get into the question of, the potential for these modes to address some of the mobility issues that I spoke about earlier. So Josh, I'd like to start with you again. So Lyft is now operating in most major cities, and you have long-term contracts in Chicago and other cities. So can you share a little, based on your experiences, can you share some examples or learnings from these pilots and from these partnerships? And specifically, if you could talk about a few examples where these modes have sort of made a dent in reducing emissions or improving accessibility or equity, or if you think it's too early to judge their impact. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. I think certainly we've seen, since really kind of the rise of dockless programs, that there's an opportunity for them to replace personal car trips. We've found that nearly half of our bike and scooter members who have a car use it less thanks to the local systems which we operate. And were bikes and scooters not available, they would otherwise, most often use a car. And so I think that presents the, real opportunity across systems, not just one city compared to another, but I think where shared bikes and scooters operate, the opportunity they have, if we kind of help nurture that, both the public and the private sector, to really achieve a bit more parity with cars in terms of the space that they're allocated, the subsidy that they're provided, direct or indirect. I think that's really a key to continuing to grow micromobility to a place where it can achieve more meaningful results and start chipping away at that, car culture that we have across the U.S. A couple examples, long-term contracts are really important to us, being able to truly make these big investments in cities that we want to make and establish deep roots in the communities we serve to really get those kind of casual riders to that more habitual place, or those who haven't tried micromobility before, really meaningfully engage with us to be able to turn them into, a regular user. So that's kind of a key piece of it. And I think a great example is the Bike Town system in Portland. We had a couple of rough years coming through the pandemic and social unrest that Portland experienced. And they also had a pretty robust scooter program with, I think, up to 5 operators at one time and thousands of devices, which of course the Bike Town bike share system was competing with. But we've come through that in 2022, and it's really been a banner year where the Bike Town system has truly hit its stride. We've seen 62% growth year over year, and we'll hit close to 600,000 trips, which is of course a record for the system. And a big factor in that has been PBOT's willingness to invest in the program. So they've not only subsidized in terms of the Bike Town for All program, the equity low-income rider program, and also they've dedicated staff to growing the Bike Town for All program. So we've now got over 2,300 members in that program, and they've taken a third of the overall trips in 2022. So it's incredibly impactful and has been a real factor in terms of how we've grown the system, working collaboratively with PBOT, the Portland Bureau of Transportation, to hit that ridership record. And we've also done some work on our part to really continue to make our own investments in the system. So we've expanded the station network there. We're hoping to achieve up to 300 stations in the next few years in Portland. We've also invested in a community outreach program with a local organization called the Street Trust, local advocates, really in support and working collaboratively with PBOT staff to grow our outreach and those community partners that we can utilize to help reach more people, get more people trying bikes, and hopefully continue that strong growth that we've seen. So I think that's really a promising sign of what the opportunity is, for other cities as they consider how, they can continue to grow micromobility in their cities.
Thank you for that. So Melinda, I want to go to you next. And I want to build off of Josh's answer and sort of dive deeper into the aspect of sustainability. And that's largely your background. So when micromobility modes sort of first entered markets, I think they came with this promise to sort of replace car trips and augment public transport by providing first and last mile services, and also reduce emissions. And we see some of that already happening. But do you think, enough of that is happening? And do you see micromobility making a significant impact on emission reduction?
Yep, great question. Again, just sort of revisiting the early days of the industry, I have to say I was a little bit shocked when I looked under the hood a little bit more and realized how short the lifespans were of electric scooters at the beginning of the industry. Now, I think there were some justifiable reasons for that. You needed to prove product market fit. I think it was not helped by the massive flurry of investment and lots of people getting into the shared micromobility game who had no business being there. But it's been nice to see over the past several years just many improvements in the scooters themselves and the bikes themselves. The hardware is just better quality, and the integration with phones and the GPS, so many things have changed very quickly and have made sure that these things just work more efficiently. And I think that was a key part of enticing people out of their car, right? You need to have a reliable system before somebody thinks that they can rely on shared electric micromobility. And if you have an experience where you go to try and take a scooter and it's, busted or dirty, or the battery is a little bit wonky, like that's going to erode your trust. And erode the potential of you considering, maybe moving from a 2-car household to a 1-car household. And I think that's what we should be focusing on with electric micromobility. I sometimes think it's not fair to think of it as like we only get sustainability credit if we replace 1-car trip with an electric scooter trip, because the fact is the way that we've designed our cities has made it totally irrational for people to choose a mode other than a car in many cases. Electric micromobility has helped to kind of move people along, but we still have a long way to go to many of Joshua's points. Like, we've just built our cities in a way that we have a long way to go to erode the sort of car dominance. And so, we're already seeing a lot of promising signs, but I think what we need to be focused on is providing people plenty of options and focusing on finding ways to incentivize the most sustainable options. And not just sustainable, right, but also like which options pose the least amount of risk to the overall transportation system, which options have, the least amount of noise, which is a big concern, which ones have the least impact on our public infrastructure, which is, in pretty bad shape. So I hope we'll sort of begin, now that this question about the sustainability of the vehicles themselves has mostly improved, and I think people are believing that these days, and there's evidence to support it, that hopefully now we'll move into thinking about our overall transport systems and valuing and incentivizing shared electric systems, micromobility ones, even more.
Thank you. And I'm just seeing some of the questions here, and there are quite a few questions on the equity aspect, and I want to go to Carrie next and talk about equity. So there's this larger skepticism about micromobility modes sort of serving only the richer neighborhoods, because infrastructure is sort of concentrated in such areas, and without subsidies, these modes tend to be unaffordable for most people. So how do you think cities, not just cities, but both the public and private sector, are perceiving this issue, and do you see any efforts on this end?
Yeah, I think there's a few sort of angles to that question I want to highlight. The first is affordability, and that's critical, a critical component of accessing shared micromobility, and something that there's a pretty strong sort of policy infrastructure around creating low cost options for people that qualify based on a variety of different programs, usually locally or federally. If you prove that you are eligible for those other programs, you get access to these very low cost, typically very low cost rides. But that does not impact affordability for anyone else, anyone that is not qualifying for those programs. And for a lot of people, that they're still price sensitive for transportation options. And so I think we're seeing a bit of a trend in sort of increasing trip costs especially for electric options. And I think that's something to really keep an eye on, because if a trip is going to be double or triple the cost of riding a bus, it becomes a very different transportation option. The second is, where are these devices and where can people ride them comfortably? So we need to focus on making sure that the devices are in a dense fabric, right? Like they have to be walking distance to places people are starting and ending. Where people might be starting at a transit station or a bus stop. People might be ending at a transit station or a bus stop, or their homes, or their place of work, or their friend's house, or at a park. But we need to think about setting up a system that has reliable and dense access to these devices, right? Like Melinda was saying about they have to be dependable. And people have to be familiar with what they are, how to ride them in the city, and where you can go, and what the options look like locally. And for some people, that might be obvious. As these systems are changing, and rapidly changing, as our infrastructure is rapidly changing, and as the way we're thinking about cities is changing, that has to include collaborating with communities to talk about what people want and what people need in terms of transportation affordability, in terms of transportation access, and really building a system that reflects the needs of a community. And together with operators and with city staff, that kind of collaboration is really foundational. A lot of cities can't at the moment really invest in the capital of a bike share program or subsidize a bike share operating system. I know there's a lot of talk about the financial viability moving forward, but really investing some portion of a staff time in supporting the program, like Josh was saying about what they're working on in Portland, having the staff time committed to really expanding the equitable access of a program can go a long way to making these programs more equitable and more sustainable.
I think you're muted, Anusha.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. So I was just saying we are almost running out of time. So I would like to quickly get into the question of partnerships. So I think the mode of engagement between the public and the private sector is sort of key to operationalizing mobility modes in different cities. So my question really is to all of you, and we can start with Josh, Carrie, and then Melinda. How do we establish better partnerships between cities and micromobility service providers? And do you see, what do you think the role of the federal government is, just in terms of regulations, improving safety, and also looking at data regulations? Could you just touch upon the role of the cities, the micromobility service providers, and federal government? We could start with Josh.
Yeah, I think it was noted before when Carrie was talking about the kind of stages that we've seen with micromobility, we've moved out of this nascent stage where companies were willing to spend a lot of money to get access into cities and dump a lot of devices and, really kind of be hands off, and hope to one day return a profit on that model. And we've seen multiple operators who've now experienced layoffs, who've left dozens of cities because of unsustainable regulatory frameworks, where whether it was kind of a pay-to-play dynamic, with burdensome fees and fines associated with the program, or short-term lengths in the programs, like a one-year pilot where, you really can't make those deep investments in whether it's infrastructure or, like building a better device. You're not incentivized as the operator in those systems to do those things. And so we really see at its core, like three pieces of a successful regulatory framework that we look for and have in many of the cities in which we operate. Really, that long-term public-private partnership approach is key to a successful program, whether it's bikes or scooters. Contracts that are extending 3 to 5 to, in some cases for bike share, like 10 years with one or, just a couple of operators is really what makes a sustainable program. We think also having a station-based program really allows us to, as I mentioned, make those big investments in cities. It creates some permanence where, devices can't just be abandoned or, picked up overnight. We really have that strong footprint that, incentivizes both us in the private sector and our public sector partners to kind of invest in the success and growth of the system. And then coordinating our planning efforts. So when we do have those station-based systems, when we're working to understand where to put protected bike lanes, making sure whether it's providing data or, just making sure our kind of siting is aligned, where we can connect our devices, our bikes and scooters with transit, where we have, a comprehensive bike network to be able to support our users. That's really I think a coordinated effort that we look for in the cities in which we operate. And so I think, that's those are the cornerstones for us of success in a partnership. And then I think a willingness to invest on the public sector side. So a few examples: Mayor Adams is leading the largest expansion of city bike stations in history. In DC, Mayor Bowser is investing $20 million to ensure DC residents are within a quarter mile of a Capital bike share station. Mayor Wu has a budget proposal to add 40 more blue bike stations to the Boston area. And in Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot is allowing us to pilot divvy bike share stations that can charge e-bikes and eventually scooters as well. So, that willingness to share in the program and not just be, we establish some regulations and let the, private sector do its thing. I think we've clearly demonstrated that doesn't work. We've moved beyond that into how to be more sustainable and establish that permanence for shared micromobility.
Carrie, do you want to go?
Sorry, I forgot the order. Yes. So I think, let me expand on some of Josh's points. This shift towards partnership is really important, but it's really complex, and it really varies based on where you are operating and how your city is structured, both from an organizational and institutional capacity framework, and also from a land use and bike network sort of mindset. And so cities want to set up strong programs, and that's going to be different for every location. I think the place for partnership is really understanding what are the goals of a city's shared micromobility program, and how can you incrementally reach those goals. Even New York didn't launch their full final program in the first moment of their launch, right? Like, these programs need to start with a strong fabric, a strong program that supports a viable and equitable system within the bounds of the goals and potential of the market, right? Like with more money and with more investment, you can create stronger programs, but you have to work within the context that you have and work towards continually improving and making your system stronger and more equitable over time. It's not a reason to not start a program, but it's a reason to continue expanding programs. And I think for most cities, that's going to require a lot of collaboration with their operator and a strong partnership founded in trust. And that's not going to come with a very short-term agreement. That kind of trust needs to be built on a very strong understanding of mutual investment and mutual ownership of the program. And I think that's a big challenge for smaller cities, but I think we're starting to see models where there's versions of permits, there's versions of different types of agreements and different mechanisms that allow some smaller cities to build these meaningful relationships with a single or two operators while still balancing that level of investment in order to create a meaningful program for their city.
And I can just add quickly, since Anusha, you mentioned the federal government in your initial question. I mean, I think I probably many people who are fans of this space were very disappointed at how little federal funding is going toward any mode other than cars. Obviously, electric cars are necessary. We live in a country where most people have no choice but to take a car. So of course, we need to provide for that. But the fact is, even if we met all of the best, most ambitious targets and got everyone into an electric car as soon as possible, we would still need to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 20% to meet climate goals. And that 20% is all about VMT, and that's about public transit, and that's about micromobility. So it would be nice to see, there's so much money coming out, and a lot of programs through the BIL and through IJA are not very clearly defined yet. So hopefully there will be opportunities for operators and cities to partner with state governments and use some of this federal funding, repurpose it to make sure that we're advancing electric micromobility alongside other forms of electric transportation.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at the question tab, and we have a lot of questions on safety concerns. So I'd like to touch upon that and see if there are any efforts, both from the private sector and the public sector side, to address some of these concerns, and also largely to manage the perception of safety and not just safety. So this is not, again, directed towards anyone. Feel free to pitch in.
I can jump in quickly. I mean, I think that we need to fundamentally rethink the way that we talk about road safety in our country. Right now, we think that safe is the safety of the driver or the rider, and there's no consideration of how much risk you're putting on the overall system and everybody else in the road network by the transportation decisions you make. And there should be more of a penalty on people who are opting to drive very large, very heavy, very fast vehicles, and more of a incentive for people who are choosing to drive lighter weight vehicles. And now, while it may be more dangerous right now for someone to take a two-wheeled mode of transportation, the risk that they're inviting and that they're putting on everybody else who didn't make a decision on which mode to ride, right, is significantly less. And it would be great to figure out a way to sort of reframe the safety conversation to focus more on the real threat, which is and remains cars.
I just note briefly in the lens of shared micromobility, I think I really applaud our partners in the city of Denver and the approach that they've taken to it, which is not that more technology will solve, the question of like what happens to people around, scooter riders who may be riding on the sidewalk, or, the the potential accessibility concerns with that. It's, providing them, with a place to ride, providing shared micromobility and, personally owned bike and scooter users with a dedicated place to ride. And that's, building out the bike network. For us, we've made commitments to delivering 200 or more parking stations to make sure we're accommodating vehicles in the place, that where they should be. And oftentimes, we're considering taking away, and the city of Denver is willing to permit, taking away a car parking space in favor of a bike and scooter parking corral. So, we applaud that approach, which is really, like doing their part, investing in the bike network and the opportunity to, kind of reclaim space from cars, whether it's, a driving lane or parking lane, what have you. Their approach has been, we need to build the infrastructure, and that's how we'll support continued growth of the program. There have been 8 million trips in the year and a half since the new program has started in Denver. It's been really promising and significant growth. And with that has come growing pains in terms of, just people and their perception of how micromobility is being used. And so, we need to do our part to educate our users. We are doing that, both like in the app, on the device itself, in-person events, and, our city partners are really supporting us in their work to try and build out the bike network and supporting infrastructure.
And I would just add to that, I think that the growth in shared micromobility is a indicator that electric biking and scooter riding just broadly is going to continue to increase. It's very popular and a very good tool for moving around cities. And so we need to continue to rethink how we're designing streets. The pinch points that we're seeing indicate a need for wider lanes, more wide in bike infrastructure, more investment in comfortable bike infrastructure, more dedicated space at intersections, higher standards on the surface quality. Some of these devices have smaller wheels and are more sensitive to maintenance needs in the bikeways, and then legible systems. People need to be able to intuit where to ride their device as they're moving around cities. And we need to focus on making the safest place to ride the right place to ride.
Thank you. I know that we are running out of time and we just have a couple of minutes, but I want to end this discussion by asking each of you all to sort of paint a picture of the future, and basically, how do you see these modes evolving in the next 10 years? What does the ideal scenario look like? And what do you think will actually happen? In just a couple of sentences, if you can. We can go Melinda, Josh, and Carrie.
I think it's realistic to assume that, and what we're already seeing is that people who get e-bikes love them. They become very big fans and suddenly realize that their trip to the grocery store wasn't quite as long as they thought it was. And so I think it's realistic for us to think that we'll see many more households, maybe up to 50% of US households 10 years from now who have electric micromobility personally owned or easy access to a shared system, or hopefully both, and are able to reduce 10 to 15% of their trips using these modes.
Yeah, and for us at Lyft, we really see kind of the future as docked, electrified, and a unified micromobility system. So what I mean by that is a shared bike and scooter system all in one. As we've done with Divvy this year, we introduced scooters under the Divvy system and also made them dockable. We are also piloting electrified docking stations in Chicago with 5 this year, expanding to, I believe, up to 30 next year, and continuing to grow from there. And we've really seen a lot of positive benefits from that. Our rates under that unified system can be much less than the kind of market rate for scooters in Chicago among our competitors. We see kind of a lift in overall micromobility trips, up to 25% increase in trips across both bikes and scooters. in the scooter service area. And that stability and kind of infrastructure investment really leads to an element of permanence that, you know, doing the work to electrify stations you can't otherwise get with a dockless or, you know, kind of traditional micromobility system. So kind of that docked electrified approach with a unified bike and scooter system is what we see as the future.
And my 10-year future is that shared micromobility is so well integrated with transit systems that it is a question of train, bike, or bus all as options of how you're making your connections and trips across the city.
Great. So on that note, I'd like to end the discussion, but before that, I'd like to thank you all for making time and joining this discussion. We'd like to stay engaged on this topic and continue this discussion. So see you all soon. Happy holidays, happy weekend, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.